Being a fan of Marvel in the 90s was kind of weird. If you were into the comic books, you were pretty much screwed, but if you were a fan of animation and live action movies, you were absolutely feasting. You had X-Men, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, The Incredible Hulk, Silver Surfer even had his own show back in the 90s, but you also had, and what many would argue to be the greatest adaptation of Spider-Man ever. And I think it really comes down to three key factors when you're talking about a Spider-Man show. The show's understanding of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, its adherence to the comic books and the source material that it is drawing from. And one thing that I think is highly underrated and seldom appreciated about adaptations in the first place, and that is the unique changes an adaptation makes to set itself apart from the source material that is still respectful to the source material. When I say something like that, think Harley Quinn from Batman the Animated Series. She was a completely original character for that show, but it added so much to the mythos of Batman, and it was such a good idea that they brought it over to the comic books. That was a great addition to an adaptation of the Batman mythos. This is something that I think the 90s Spider-Man did such a great job of doing, was balancing the respect for the source material, the identity and character of Peter and Spider-Man, and adding brand new things to that source material and changes for their own world that just felt cohesive to that world and made the adaptation unique and worth watching on its own merits, even if you were a huge fan of the character already. And with all that established, let's go ahead and start with Peter Parker. As opposed to how we see Peter in just about every animated adaptation nowadays, in the 1990s it was a lot different. Since 2000, and I attribute this largely to Ultimate Spider-Man, each and every one of Peter's adaptations outside of two shows have been him in high school and being a teenager. But in the 90s, the most predominant adaptation of the character was actually a college-aged adult Spider-Man, one that particularly worked for the Daily Bugle, taking photos. That is where we spend a majority of our time with this version of Peter Parker. He is either at college, going on dates, or he's taking pictures for the Bugle. Honestly, he spends more time taking photos for the Bugle and being Spider-Man in this show than he does being a college student, but that's the general vibe that we get from this show, and that's because that was what was popular for the character at the time. We were in peak adulthood Spider-Man, and the show reflected that, and he comes with all of the traits of a great Peter Parker adaptation. The overwhelming and constant guilt that drives him to use his powers for the betterment of everybody around him, even at the detriment of himself. His overwhelming need to take care of Aunt May, even if it means selling photos of himself to a man he knows will slander his name till the end of time for simply wearing a mask. His incredibly comedic Parker luck, his good looks, and obviously exuberant charm.
Why, Miss Whitman, is that a compliment? From you?
Don't push your luck, Peter.
His constant, almost incessant internal monologue, which was just a great way for the writers of the show to include a lot more dialogue without actually having to animate moving a character's mouth. I thought that was absolutely a fantastic use of time, and what was really just a great workaround of limitations just made Spider-Man feel so much more alive and like we were actually sharing a headspace with the character, as Peter is almost always thinking to himself throughout each and every one of the episodes. This Peter Parker also shows a wide variety of emotions. There are times that we see him at absolute rock bottom and sad and miserable. There are times that we see him genuinely happy and on top of the world. There are times where we see him downright mad and angry.
Back here, Shocker! Shocker!
And that's something that I feel like a lot of Spider-Man adaptations, especially modern ones, just completely forget about, is that Spider-Man is an angsty, angry person, especially in his early college days, which is what this show is starting out with. That is how Spider-Man is. Another thing that they go out of their way to showcase is that he is a loner, especially during the 90s and early 2000s, and even up until today. Like, Spider-Man is not a team player. The only team that has ever tolerated Spider-Man, truly tolerated him, has been the Fantastic Four. And that is because he's an asshole. And I just feel like a lot of adaptations of the character forget that Spidey is kind of a dick. And that's why a lot of teams don't work with him. That's why a lot of people don't want to work with him. And that's why he ends up working by himself so often. And while that is less true nowadays, that was really the truth back during the 90s when this show was coming out. And speaking of Spidey, I think most people that talk about this show or have watched this show or hear about this show are pretty familiar with the fact that Spider-Man was not allowed to punch at all during this show. It was one of the weird restrictions of Fox Kids, I believe. They just weren't allowed to throw any punches, which was really weird because Batman the Animated Series was around during this time, and that man was throwing punches whenever he felt like it. And there was blood in that show, but different networks have different regulations, I guess. Hi, Vinny from the future here, or I guess past. Correction, they aired on the same network. The difference was Spider-Man was a Saturday morning cartoon which had more restrictions, whereas Batman was a prime-time evening cartoon which had less restrictions, hence the blood and violence relative to the more strict rules that Spider-Man had to follow, being a Saturday morning cartoon and generally geared more towards children, whereas BTAS could get away with a lot more. And so Spider-Man doesn't. But when I was watching this as a kid, I owned a lot of this on DVD. I was not born in the 90s. I'm way too young for that. When I was watching a lot of these on DVDs, I never noticed, to be very honest with you. Spider-Man would just use a lot of kicks, he was very acrobatic, and I really did love the creative use of web fluid that was constant throughout the show. I loved the swapping of web cartridges. That's something that I feel like even Spectacular, which is a show that I love to death, didn't really treat the web shooters like they were a part of Spider-Man's kit, as much as they were just a minor inconvenience. This show truly treats it like it is a tool Spider-Man needs. We're constantly seeing him run out of web fluid, we're seeing him make web fluid, we are seeing him swap his cartridges out, we're seeing him create new web fluid compounds to deal with the different villains of the week that he has to go against, specifically thinking about Hydro Man in season 2. I mean, Spider-Man, personality-wise as well, is everything you could want out of Spider-Man. He has a wide range of emotions, just like Peter Parker.
Learn! I am tired of you, and your riddles, and your lessons, and your supreme arrogance!
He is quippy, he's genuinely funny, and the dude is expertly voiced by Christopher Daniel Barnes. I mean, he's the voice I think of when I read any adult Spider-Man comic. That's the voice that comes to mind. Particularly when I was reading the new Ultimate Spider-Man series that started in 2024. That's the voice I pictured that Peter having. It just fits so well for me.
Uh-huh. And did they belong to little pink elephants?
This show also tries to do a lot of things other Spider-Man shows either get canceled too early to do or are never brave enough to try, and that is to advance Peter Parker throughout the story to let him grow. At one point in the show, he was going to marry Mary Jane. The two of them were quite literally having a wedding, and if it wasn't for the fact that she was revealed to be a clone, dude was going to be married. That's a gigantic step to see in any adaptation of Spider-Man, as, to the best of my knowledge, not a single adaptation of the character in animation lets the dude be happy in a relationship. But I think one of the few things this show was lacking in was the development between Harry Osborn and Peter Parker. I never really got the sense that the two were great friends in this show. Like, they shared an apartment for one, maybe 2 episodes in the show, and I could have sworn they spent a whole lot more time together in the comics, especially sharing an apartment, building a relationship. Harry really just seemed to fall to the wayside, especially after the first season, until it was time for him to be the Green Goblin. I felt like they were friends, but that they weren't close, which is something that, like, in the 80s specifically, those two characters were really close. They were roommates, they were great friends. We don't get to see a whole lot of their friendship, and while we do have a huge focus on Peter and MJ and Peter and Aunt May, I feel like we don't get a lot of emphasis on his relationship with his friends outside of his potential romantic interests. And I just kind of chalked that up to time. Each episode was like 22 minutes without commercials, and it's a kids' TV show. So again, I find that that is most likely a time restriction relative to everything else going on in the show. And when that's the major criticism that I'm levying at the character of Spider-Man, is I wish he had spent more time interacting with those around him, that should go to tell you just how great of a character he is, because I want to see more of him interacting with his world. Because not only did this show do Peter Parker amazing, they did Spider-Man amazing as well. And typically when we're watching a Spider-Man show, we might get a really great Spider-Man, but maybe just a mediocre Peter Parker. It's really nice to have a show that does a good job at both. And since we're already on the topic of comic book accuracy and adherence to what Peter did before in respect for the source material, I feel like this is a good time to transition over to talking about that aspect of the show. I think the show actually does a really wonderful job at being respectful to the Spider-Man source material. As I've already discussed when talking about Peter and Spider-Man, I think they hit the nail on the head when it comes to anything Spider-Man related, basically from 1970 through 90. I think they really embodied that kind of Spider-Man perfectly within this show and the context of this show. Obviously toned down a little bit for the child audience that they had in mind, but I think they really embodied that style of Spider-Man. The show also takes inspiration from a ton of different comic book tie-ins throughout a lot of Spider-Man's history. The whole first season is really setting up the world and setting up Spider-Man's villains. So we see things like the Lizard. We're going to see J. Jonah Jameson specifically, much like he was back in the 1960s, in collaboration for the Spider Slayers. We're going to see him in collaboration for, actually need to print a retraction, and I know I haven't done one in 20 years, but he was not involved with the Spider Slayers, just involved with making Scorpion, because he is an evil, vindictive man, but he's not that evil. We get to see the Chameleon at the very end of the first season, who is actually Spider-Man's first ever supervillain. The entire first season is kind of setting up all of these major Spider-Man villains and plot points that come up. Even some of the later ones, so like season 1 weaves in the alien symbiote costume, which includes Venom and that entire arc. I also forgot to mention, this is the show where the common misconception that the symbiote is purely evil comes from. That was entirely made up for the show, and it's actually one of the changes that I think has done more harm than good. While I may love the show to death, I think this show helped propagate the idea that the symbiote is evil and that it is just this bad entity, and Spectacular helped to do the same thing, when in reality, that is not what the symbiote is. But since a lot of people have engaged with Spider-Man media specifically through these cartoons, especially growing up, this has unfortunately been their only interaction with the symbiote, so presenting it as though it is just this evil alien goo has done a lot more harm for the symbiote's PR than good, when in reality, it really does take more of the approach of its host when it comes to being bonded, and the symbiote was kind of a twofold factor in the original comics, where its first host was Deadpool, which drove it a little bit insane, and then it was scorned by Spider-Man taking it off, as it genuinely loved Peter, and it thought it was doing all of the right things to make Peter a better Spider-Man and a better person. And so when Peter rejected it, it was extremely upset, like a jealous ex-girlfriend. And Eddie Brock's mentally unstableness at the time just helped fuel that. That's how we got to the symbiote being perceived as evil as it is. And then it bonded with Matt Gargan, who's just insane, like genuinely an insane killer. This version of Spider-Man is well established in his universe when we meet him. He's not new to this and he's not a rookie, but we are seeing him slowly build up his rogues gallery throughout the first season, and we're slowly seeing him get to butt heads with Kingpin and start to make waves in the underground and against real supervillains. The entire second season is all about gene manipulation and all about how Spider-Man's own powers are turning against him. If you've ever remembered reading about the time Spider-Man quite literally turns into a gigantic, multi-armed human spider, they took inspiration from that entire storyline and then weaved it together with Morbius, one of my personal favorite villains from Spider-Man's past. And they had to do, you know, a little bit of censoring. They couldn't have been blood, so he was looking to suck your plasma, which is in your blood, so he's taking your blood anyways. But they were able to spend the entire second season dedicated to that. They also introduced us to the Punisher, who was originally a Spider-Man villain. They take all of these larger concepts from the comic books and they're trying to break them down into digestible formats for kids, while also giving us satisfying overarching stories for each season. I really loved the commitment to multiple episode arcs. The fact that the symbiote, for example, back in season 1, that took place over 3 separate episodes. It felt like you were reading a genuine set of comic books inside of one larger issue set. It really helped to push the idea that there was continuity between each and every episode. And we really see that start to come to a head with season 3 and the focus on Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin, a background character that has been around throughout a majority of the first 2 seasons, mostly working for Kingpin. It was a lot of stuff with weird dimensional travel and eventually even an adaptation of the death of Gwen Stacy. And this is where we start to see things differ. And this is where I brought up earlier about, I believe it's important for an adaptation to, while respecting the source material, make changes that make it so that the adaptation can stand on its own merits and is worth watching even to longtime fans, because they add something new or change a certain dynamic. And for this show, it was the relationship between Peter and MJ that we see get highlighted the most. Throughout the comics, Peter was actually spending a majority of his time in college crushing on and dating Gwen Stacy. MJ was just kind of around. She was a part of the friend group, she dated around, she was a free spirit, and wasn't really looking to anchor down to anybody. It wasn't until the death of Gwen Stacy that Peter and MJ became the item. They became the it couple that became popular, and we see the two of them together for a long time up until recently. I don't think they've really been together in the last 15 years seriously, outside of obviously the new Ultimates comics that came out. The show basically replaces Gwen with MJ, and while they do continue to retain aspects of Mary Jane where she is this free spirit, she's not willing to necessarily tie herself down to Peter immediately, and she does make him work for the relationship. She is taking the place of Gwen. And so when it was time to tell the story of the death of Gwen Stacy, they instead replaced it with Mary Jane. And that was something that I thought made sense for this TV show. I'm not entirely sure why they chose not to use Gwen Stacy, but I am firm in believing that their choice to still adapt that story and replace her with Mary Jane was the right move. I think it added a lot of tension, I think it was great, and I think it allowed for season 4 to open up a lot of different plot points when MJ is not there, specifically regarding Peter and his relationship sphere. And that's when we get to season 4, where I feel like the show truly starts to deviate away from purely comic book source material and starts to really try to make waves for itself throughout the rest of the show. And I say that specifically because of the way they decided to treat Black Cat. She is so utterly different than the comic book counterpart, she might as well be an original character. I mean, she's involved in the Super Soldier program, getting a version of the Super Soldier serum. She is not stealing of her own volition, but rather because Kingpin is demanding it of her. It is like a transformation that she goes through when she wants to become the Black Cat. And Felicia Hardy throughout the entire show is nothing like the Felicia Hardy that we've come to know reading comic books. She is a studious college student who takes everything pretty seriously. She's completely opposite to the Felicia Hardy that we know in the comic books, and she might as well have been an entirely different and newly made up character for the show. But I think it works in the context of the show, and I think the relationship, however brief, that she has between her and Spider-Man, and while it works for the show, I would never want it to become mainline. I completely forgot to mention this, but like Carnage in season 3 of the show is just, he differs a lot from his comic book counterpart, and that just comes down to the fact that I'm surprised they even adapted Carnage, because the dude is insane and murderous and extremely violent and flippant, and like took a lot of balls to put him in the show, and he was very funny and enjoyable. And then, of course, we go on to see characters such as Kraven the Hunter, who is Again, vastly different than his comic book counterpart, and is straight up just a good guy who takes drugs that make him bad. Like, that's just his whole character arc. Kraven in the comics is very much a big game hunter that truly loves hunting Spider-Man for the thrill of the hunt. He hunts people and animals for sport. Like, that is his thing. At least, like, traditionally, and at the time in the 80s, that was kind of his thing. But the show adapts him in a very, very different way. And again, works great for the show, not exactly something I would have wanted to have seen be carried over. All of these little changes help to make the show, for me at least, enjoyable on its own merits. Even as an adaptation of Spider-Man, it doesn't just feel like I'm watching something that's pulled one-to-one from the page, but rather that I am watching something that somebody has tried to put a lot of passion and effort into making their own. This is their own version of Spider-Man that is still respectful to all of the iterations that came before it. And I think that's the mark of a truly great adaptation. I also think that working within the limitations of a kid's show helped to elevate this product. Sometimes I think some of the greater ideas that come out of these kids shows are made because of the limitations. For example, the creative use of webbing throughout all of this show, unlike a lot of other Spider-Man shows, was because he couldn't punch. And that's something that we seem to lose as we go into more modern shows that involve Spider-Man, because he's just allowed to hit things now. And this is all without talking about season 5, which did its own kind of secret wars, which got together a bunch of heroes and villains from throughout the entire Marvel universe. The little miniature kind of interconnectedness of the Marvel universe at the time with like the Hulk, Iron Man, you know, X-Men show was all kind of connected. I don't know if Silver Surfer counts towards this because he was really doing his own thing in his show. But it also introduced what I would argue is the very first instance of Spider-Verse ever, at the very, like, the second to last episode of the show. Madam Web throughout the entire show has pretty much been grooming Spider-Man to take on an evil Carnage version of himself one day, and with the help of like 4 other Spider-Men from different realities. This was the first instance of a Spider-Verse, a very small contained Spider-Verse, but this was the instance of it. And I thought that was really, really cool and a really phenomenal idea to come out of this show. Something completely original that we would eventually see adapted into a video game with Shattered Dimensions that would eventually inspire the Spider-Verse comic book series, that would eventually inspire the movie that I absolutely love to death. And it all started with those 2 episodes of this show, so big thank you to this show and the people that worked on it. This show was also my very first introduction to the Scarlet Spider, and well, I found him super cool in the show, and then I went to go read about him, and I read the Clone Saga after that, and well, I think you can imagine how I felt about that, as many other people did. I do also find it hilarious that this show pokes fun at the Clone Saga, as it pretty much began right when the Clone Saga started and actually ended up outlasting the Clone Saga, and I find it so funny. Like, the literal title of episode 12 of season 5 is "I'm so sick of clones" or something along those lines. It's genuinely hilarious. This show isn't perfect. I don't think any adaptation of any show is perfect, despite what the titles of my videos say. YouTube is just, they very much like to see the extremes, and if I just put "this show is okay," most people don't care. And that's just me being real with you for a minute. Like, I don't think this show is perfect, but I think it is phenomenal. I think it is worth a watch. I think it is a wonderful adaptation of the character of Spider-Man, and I think no matter how familiar you are with the character of Spider-Man, you're going to find new things to enjoy about this show, and you're going to find new surprises. I didn't want to spoil just about everything that this show has to offer here. I just wanted to give it a more broad overview and kind of just talk about why I like this show so much, and also use this as a jumping off point to see if you guys are interested in seeing me talk more about this show, specifically more in depth. I'd be very open to doing that in the future. So thank you all so much for watching, and I just remembered that Red Skull has a son in this show, and it's Electro. And I'm just going to leave you with that as a thank you for watching to the end of the video.